Hey everyone, and welcome to my patch 13.21 tier list for mid lane. Now, not a whole lot has changed on this patch specifically, but the meta has kind of shaken itself out a bit from the previous patch 13.20, and I've definitely moved a few things around here and there, and I've also gotten rid of the D tier completely. So in this video, I'll talk about all the stuff, like why some of the champs are super high up. I'll talk about some of the champs that have been buffed or nerfed or why I've moved them around. I'll also talk about blind picks at the end, so make sure you stick around for that as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is why did I get rid of D tier? And just before that, I'll just show you guys my cam's not actually covering anything. It's perfectly positioned here in the bottom right. But why did I get rid of D tier? So mainly because I think once you're getting down to these champions, at least in my opinion, there's no champs that are really just terrible mid, right? Like there's nothing that is just super weak, that's non-viable, that never really has the situation to be played. And I think it becomes quite hard to differentiate the power in situational champs once you get down to this level, because it's kind of like, well, how are we really rating these champs against each other? Is it the number of situations they're useful in? Is it their power that they have when they're in a good situation? I think it's quite hard to rank them against each other. So for me, what is now the C tier and is formerly, part of the D tier as well, is basically all these champs in here, they have their niche situations, they're good at different times, they're bad at different times. Overall, I would say they're probably not the kind of champs that you want to be spamming. You don't want to be picking them every game. You do want to, make sure they're counter picks, either compositionally or matchup wise. But they all have potential, right? And I'll get to some of the specific champs within this tier later, but I mainly just wanted to say again that the D tier is gone, and this was basically why. So following on from that, with these being our situational champs at the bottom, the champs at the top are going to be ones that kind of bring what is considered valuable in the current meta. So for those of you that haven't watched the previous tier list, I'd say the things that are quite valuable right now is the ability to win your lane and scale. So there's a lot of champions up here that are both quite strong in lane and scale very, very well. While snowballing did get nerfed a little bit, and while the game did get a little longer, there's still definitely potential for snowballing. So having the ability to win your lane, to get priority, to impact the map early, I still think is very valuable, especially because a lot of these champions are just scaling monsters as well. It feels pretty unfair to some of the champs on this list. They either win lane and don't scale at all, or they scale really well, but they're completely useless in lane. So yeah, that doesn't feel too fair. Another thing that's valuable is mobility. So there's still quite a lot of gank set up, and I have noticed that while there are maybe a few more farming junglers being played, there's still plenty of ganking supports, plenty of ganking junglers. So if you can use phase rush, or if you have a dash, or you have some sort of self peel, that generally makes you a little safer, and I think that puts you higher up on the list. There are some champions where if you know you're not versus any threat at all, are actually quite strong. So a real quick example would be something like Brand. I think Brand's actually really, really good if you have no threat onto you whatsoever. But the problem is he's very immobile, he's very short range, he's very punishable basically every stage of the game. So that's why Brand would be very low on this list, right? But ultimately, if you can get a game where there's no ganking jungle support and maybe enemy mid is weak in lane or something, it's actually quite a good Brand game, right? So as I was saying, these champs down here do have potential. For specific champs, I'll really quickly mention Orianna, even though I talked about her a lot in the last video. I think she's still the best mid in the game. She's very good in pretty much every lane, every situation, and I was very surprised to see that she just dodged nerfs completely this patch. Not only did they not nerf the champ, but I was expecting, a phase rush nerf for range champs. They actually nerfed it for melees, which was pretty surprising to me. So yeah, I don't think I really need to elaborate on Orianna anymore. Still just very strong, best mid in the game, and also a very good blind pick. Next one I'm going to talk about is Jayce. So you might be surprised to see Jayce so high up in the list when they just nerfed two of his keystones. A slight nerf to first strike, slight nerf to phase rush melees, but I still think he's the premier AD blind pick, and I also think he benefits a lot from the Doran's changes. So obviously the Doran's blade buff is nice for him, and the Doran's shield can be used in some of those more difficult matchups. Something like Orianna, you can go the D shield second win, and it's very, very hard to poke you out of lane. I also think he works well with a lot of the AP junglers, and overall, I think just it's quite difficult to blind pick a lot of AD champions because they do have a lot of counters, but it feels like Jayce is the most blind pickable of them. It's not to say that he doesn't have some difficult matchups, but he still has win conditions even in those difficult matchups. Stuff like the Jayce versus Zia that I covered on my channel a few days ago between Chovy and Nemesis. I think that's a good example of that. So yeah, overall, I still think Jayce is very, very strong. LeBlanc's another one that I've put a bit higher up. She did get some buffs to her W and E. It was AP ratios though, and generally like AP ratios don't feel that different until later in the game when you get a lot of AP. But I do think the AP ratio on W is still kind of nice for the early game, because a lot of the time it means you don't have to be super fed to be one-shotting the wave with W. Like it can be the difference between leaving all the creeps on 1 HP and not. So I think that's actually kind of a nice buff. And yeah, I mean, having buffs to her late game is good. LeBlanc's never really been weak late game, but it's like it gets harder to play as late game goes on, especially as people like get more lifesteal and stuff. So it can be that if you don't one-shot someone late game, your job is kind of done because you just, you don't have any cooldowns left, at least for another 15 seconds. And when the fights are super fast late game, that can be the difference between winning or losing. So I do think the buffs are kind of nice. You do need to be careful picking LeBlanc. I don't think she's particularly good as a blind. There are definitely some dangerous champs like Ori, Lissandra, Vex. But I think if you're using her as a counter, I mean, at least for me, when I see like ganking jungle and ganking support on my team, she's basically an insta-lock. Like I've played a couple games against like mobile mids, stuff like Syndra recently, and I have, ganks set up on my team, and it's so easy just to farm them. So in that sense, I think she's very valuable. I think she has a very carved out niche for herself in the meta, but you still need to be quite careful when you're picking her. I've moved Taliyah down to the B tier, and I still think she's pretty strong, but the main reason I put her down is because it feels like it's really difficult to get a favorable first base in a lot of the meta matchups. So when you're playing against, stuff like the Ori, the Syndra, the Azir, even some of these champs over here, you're always going to base kind of at some sort of deficit early, and that's not too bad, right? Taliyah does scale well and obviously does very well into melee heavy comps, but the problem is, like, if you lose a lot of agency over the early game, it feels like you are just kind of scaling up, right? Like you don't have the winning lane and scaling win condition, which I think some of these champions do. So for me, she has fallen down a little bit. I still think she is absolutely exceptional to melee heavy comps, but again, I think some of the meta champs, the ones that are stronger in lane at least, do give her a bit of trouble. I've moved Sylas down a little bit as well, but I don't even think that Sylas is weaker. In fact, he might even be stronger because of the D-Shield buff. But the main reason I moved him down is because it feels like he is a bit more situational than the champs up here, but that's not to say that he's not like really, really good in games when it's good for him, right? Like if you have a relatively easy matchup, if you have a support in jungle that can help you out, if you have good ults on the enemy team, he quickly rises in priority, but I think it was kind of unfair to move a champ down like Taliyah and not move Sylas along with her. So yeah, again, a pretty strong champ. Don't really feel like he's weaker per se, just more situational than the ones in S and A tier. I've moved Ahri up a little bit this patch. So Ahri is kind of in a weird spot because she's not weak by any means, but I do think she doesn't really have a niche carved out for her. So, champs like Lissandra tend to be, very solid as blind picks, or champs like LeBlanc do a lot of the same things that Ahri does. I think if there is a situation for Ahri, it's when you're kind of like, so LeBlanc is a champ that's good for when you need mobility, but you have like gank set up on your team. Whereas Ahri is a champ that is more self-sustainable, right? Like she can neutralize some of those matchups. It's kind of like a champ that needs, if you need mobility, but you're not expecting any help from your team and you kind of just want to play utility. I also think it's better to play Ahri, or like LeBlanc prefers to be solo AP generally if she can, it's not required, but if she can. Whereas Ahri, because she can build utility, can function, as a secondary AP or whatever. So I guess Ahri does have some sort of niche, and she deserves to be high up in this list because she is still a solid blind. She is overall very solid in solo queue, but I still think in terms of just like when I'm picking Ahri, most of the time I'll be picking LeBlanc or Lissandra instead, unless there's some really, really good situation for her. I've already talked about the C tier, but I want to talk about a couple of the champs in there specifically. So the first one's going to be Aurelion Sol. I was extremely surprised to see A-Sol get nerfed this patch. I mean, in my mind, A-Sol is a very weak champion. He does scale well, but he doesn't scale so well that he's just like a 1v9 win condition in the late game, right? Like he can still be dealt with, especially if he doesn't have his kind of supercharged ultimate. And overall, I'm not really sure what niche A-Sol has at the moment. He doesn't really like win many lanes. Maybe he wins lanes against some other super scalers, but at the same time, right, like you can always go back to one of these champs that wins lane and scales. So yeah, I don't know. Extremely surprised by the A-Sol nerfs. I think they were definitely unwarranted, and maybe it's because he has like higher win rate and lower elos where he doesn't get punished. I'm not too sure, but it's a champ that I barely see in high elo even pre-nerf. Other one I'm going to talk about is Kassadin, and I got a lot of comments on my last video because I put Kassadin, pretty much bottom of D tier, and you guys, perhaps rightfully so, question that, where he has such a high win rate. Should he be rated so low? So to give, I guess, like more context to it, in my opinion, like Kassadin is a champion that doesn't win lane against many champs. He does against some, but not against many. So you're basically just getting that scaling win condition. And admittedly, like Kassadin scales pretty well. But as we were saying before, right, there's champs up here that both win lane and scale harder. I also said that the reason that Kassadin doesn't win lane very often is because if people blind pick the meta champs, again, stuff like Syndra, stuff like Ori, picking Kassadin into them is kind of like a waste, right? Like he doesn't get pushed into them, he doesn't win out in the 1v1. So basically what I was saying is if people blind pick properly, Kassadin shouldn't be good. On the other side of that coin, I have played several games lately against champs that should not be blinded. I think I've played 3 games in the last patch against like Katarina blind picks, right? And so if people are blind picking poorly in high elo, I'm sure they're blind picking poorly out of high elo too. And in that sense, if you can get one of these matchups against something like a Katarina or an Akali or a Sylas, where you both win lane and scale, Kassadin can be very, very powerful in those situations. But I would just be In my mind, he's not really worth playing against pretty much any range champion. Maybe stuff like Corki where you can win lane and scale as well. But again, I think be very careful picking Kassadin. I really don't think you're getting value out of the champion if you're just picking every game. At least that's my opinion. I mean, maybe you could play some of the more early game runes and play for kind of like a mid game scaling build. You could go something like First Strike Everfrost and just play for that kind of one item power spike. Things like that can work. But overall, at least in my elo, at least the way I'm using my champion pool, Kassadin does not get a lot of value because I am blind picking properly, and when I go to counter pick, there's generally stuff that wins lane harder. Finally, I'll talk about the 13.21 blind picks, and I'll also talk about my thought process for blind picking at the moment, and if you want to copy that, you can. Otherwise, we just get some insight into what I think is valuable. So pretty much, I think at the moment, if Orianna is open and you're blind picking, you should just pick Orianna. I don't think there's that many reasons to pick other champs. The only reason I might not would be if there was something maybe that worked better with my jungle support, but it's going to be very rare because I think Orianna is, again, just super overtuned and works well with pretty much everything. So that's kind of my starting point, is if I'm blind picking and Orianna is open, I pretty much just pick her. Now, if Orianna is banned, what am I looking for next? Well, it probably depends on if I need AD or AP. So pretty much if I need AD, I'm probably looking at Jayce, unless I need an AD with mobility, in which case I'm probably looking at Tristana or maybe Pantheon. So Tristana is a bit riskier. In my mind, her lanes, she wins lanes harder, but also loses lanes harder than Jayce. And I think Pantheon can kind of be the same thing, where there are some matchups that are actually quite tough if you don't get assistance, but they do have a bit of mobility. They're a bit better if you're going to get camped, or at least if that's what you're expecting. So that's what I'm kind of thinking for the AD blinds. For my AP, it'll depend a little bit on what they have shown, I guess, or like if I'm just like purely blind picking, I haven't seen anything else, I would probably go towards something like Azir because I get mobility. It again works well in most comps and it does well in most lanes. If I have like ganks up on my team, I think Lissandra is a pretty good blind. Like Lissandra in general also functions pretty well. Like if you prefer a champ like Lissandra over Azir, well, one, because she's easier, but also because she is better at early skirmishing and stuff like that, you can definitely look for that. So this is kind of my next tier of blinds, I guess, is stuff like Azir, Lissandra. After that, I mean, what other blinds am I really looking at? I mean, you can consider Syndra a blind. It's very blindable matchup-wise. There are some difficult ones, stuff like Akali, stuff like LeBlanc with gank setup, and it can also be difficult if they have a lot of ganking champs on their team. So you might consider this as a blind if you've seen some of this like support and jungles and stuff, but otherwise I probably wouldn't. Other good blind picks, like let's say none of this applies or you don't really like those champs. I mean, if you want to just like have solid blinds overall, like Ahri and Lux, I think aren't, S tier champs, but they're pretty solid blinds overall. They're hard to punish. They do well most of the time. If you have, good ganks up on your team, stuff like LeBlanc can be locked in. Or you could even go for something more situational. I've said this before, but sometimes if your comp's looking really good, some champs that are normally not blindable can be. Like, Galio is not really a blindable champ normally because the matchups suck. But if you have something like Jarvan, Camille, Rakan on your team, then he becomes pretty blindable. So yeah, I mean, as I was saying before, I guess to kind of summarize the blind picks, I think like it's still kind of like Ori, Azir, Lissandra, Jayce, Triss. These are kind of the best. I do think like Ori is still like turbo broken though. But yeah, that's kind of gives you some ideas maybe and stuff you consider blind. Obviously, if you're not sure, feel free to ask in the comments section below. Otherwise, I think it's going to be it for this video. Again, not a whole lot of changes, so not a ton to talk about, but hopefully you guys found it enjoyable. Anyway, if you did like the video, go ahead and like and subscribe. I'll see you guys in the next one.